Welcome to our viewers on Globespan 24/7 as we broadcast to you here live from New York and around the world, our Monday night program. I know today it's November the 15th, the half of the month, and of all days, it is a very bitter cold day here in New York. I believe in the next couple of days, it will be very cold compared to those of you in Guyana, where we are told it is the opposite, is very hot. So if you need some cool air and want to feel cold, come to New York and you'll enjoy this beautiful cold weather that we're experiencing now. We want to thank Nohar Singh for making this platform available, and of course to Devin Bissu, our technical specialist, for allowing us to broadcast it around the world. This evening, there is no stranger to us. He has been in politics for many years. He served under President Burnham, under President Hoyt, under President Greenidge, and now he's a special portfolio within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in this current PP administration. Mr. Carl Greenidge, welcome to the program tonight.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sugrim and Dr. Rose. I'm happy to have been able to join you this evening. No hitches so far on the technical side, and only the hot sun and threat of rain that we have to deal with.
Okay.
My pleasure.
Dr. Rose, my co-host, welcome, sir.
Thank you, Charles, and welcome to all our listeners in and out of Guyana.
Mr. Greenidge, before we start, get into the details, and today we're talking about foreign policy and the border dispute, for which you have been specially kept by this administration to work with them on hopefully getting this settled at the World Court, as we know the matter is there currently. But before we get into that, we want to know a little background of you. When did you enter into politics? I think it's the first time you're coming to our program. When did you enter politics, and what lured you into the political realm?
Well, that's an interesting question. I have been, it is true, in politics in a very long time. I first entered the political arena formally in 1983, formally. I was lured by the challenges facing Guyana at that time. In '83, we didn't yet recognize that you had a crisis on the horizon, that crisis that we faced in the late 1980s. And so there was a fiscal crisis to do with managing our finances and ensuring that the very key public sector agencies, and we come back to the question you raised just now, the industry you raised just now, rice, bauxite in particular, and at that time, expanding manufacturing sector. The question was how to make them perform as effectively as they should by having appropriate fiscal and monetary policies. And that was what I was brought in to do. I had worked within the university context, that is in Kenya, in the United Kingdom, in Guyana, at the University of Guyana, looking both at planning, at agricultural policy, agricultural economics, and in the area of fiscal policy. That is to do with taxation and the monetary policies. And that was what I was drawn in to do. I thought it a very exciting time, and started quite young. Many people complain now that they've been hearing my name so long that they assume that I really should not be in a position to be walking upright. But in fact, I entered as a minister at the age of just in my very early 30s. I had been on the public, if you like, public view, because I used to do something called analysis, which Ian MacDonald, my neighbor, now does. I did it in the early days with Professor Leslie Cummings, and subsequently did, as Chief Planning Officer, come into the arena by working with many of the heads of our corporations and the permanent secretaries and ministers. I wouldn't call that the political arena, but that is at the on the technical side, working with our technicians to ensure that we could confront the challenges that were facing us at the beginning of the 1980s and, well, at the end of the 1970s, the beginning of the 1980s. That's my background.
And I believe in 1980, if I'm correct, that Guyana was declared bankrupt at that time by the president, if my recollection is right.
No, I don't think that's a correct recollection. Guyana was never declared bankrupt by any of its presidents. The Commonwealth was working with us from the late 1970s on restructuring of the economy, and you may remember that Kun Loeb Lehman Brothers, one of the most prominent merchant bankers in the world, had been commissioned by the government of Guyana to assist in the restructuring of the public corporations, which included Guymine, Bidco, Gaisuco, and so forth. And you had an IMF program in '79, which created a lot of problems. You then had a program that ran and broke down and ran and broke down until what I would term the crisis of 1988-89, when we then featured as one of the most heavily indebted countries in the world. The question of bankruptcy is really a propaganda comment from elsewhere. It is rare for a country to enter that state or to even admit it. But the point is this: the specific concern in relation to the Guyana economy was that it was in fiscal imbalance, it had balance of payments challenges, and therefore it had to deal with questions of its indebtedness. That is the issue.
No wonder, sir, you're such a great economist, because your terminology tell us that bankruptcy is not the right word to use, so we can use all the technical terms. But we couldn't pay our bills at that time, and then the president started to restrict.
But that was not true. That was not true in 1980. That's the first point I'm making.
Oh, okay. So it went back before that. It went back before that.
The chronic problem arose later in the 1980s.
I got you. Okay. So you are there, so you would know exactly the dates and so on. So when President Burnham invited you in '83, as you came to Guyana, I couldn't recall, were you directly a minister at the time, or you went to the agency within the ministry?
No, when I was teaching at the University of Guyana from 1974 and doing these programs, bringing into the public view, such as the radio programs. And then I was working as the chief planning officer with Mr. Clarence Ellis. In 1983, in 1981, I had left to go back to the United Kingdom to do a PhD program in economic planning, and was working on that when President Burnham passed through and asked to see me. So I saw him, and he was explaining of some challenges that the country was facing and the need for me to contribute to resolving those difficulties, which at that stage, as I was saying, had not yet become quite chronic, but they were very serious in terms of balance of payments crises, for example. And so I was then appointed as Senior Minister of Finance in '83 as a result of that approach.
Okay, I got you. And then on the demise of President Burnham, President Hoyt kept you on as the Minister of Finance until 1992 when the government changed.
He kept me on as Minister of Finance. Yes, that is so. But I had been Minister of Finance and Planning, also with responsibility for all trade matters. So it was a very big portfolio.
Okay, and I want our viewers to know, Mr. Greenidge, that when President Hoyt introduced the ERP, you were the mastermind behind that, and I think Guyana have to give you credit for what you did to the economy during that period from 1985 to 1992. And on behalf of Globespan, we want to thank you for your contribution in those years. Challenging though it was, you did a marvelous job, I believe, and most Guyanese would recognize your contribution during that period. So are you enjoying politics, Mr. Greenidge?
Well, politics offers the opportunity for both enjoyment and disappointment. It is an arena like that. You're never sure when you wake up in the morning where you will be at the end of the day in terms of your emotions. As you ask me at this specific point in time, I am at a reasonably good place, and if you like, the political action is not as intense as it was, let us say, when I was a minister. I'm dealing with a specific issue, and I'm not on a daily basis handling those sorts of political problems that were typical when I was Minister of Finance or Minister of Planning.
And we'll get into your detailed portfolio as we go on the program. But as we told all the ministers in President Ali's administration, they all look so well. They look younger, and you are looking younger as well, having worked. But there's something President Ali is doing to his team around him. Maybe hard work might be the answer.
There's a belief in politics that there are some of the world's most famous politicians were only kept alive by their political activities. As soon as they stepped down from those activities, they met their demise. I would say to you, however, in my case, my children are of the view that the politics is wearing me down, and they're suggesting that I'm looking a lot older than I ought to look. So they are wanting to work on
tell them they're wrong.
But let me say, before I forget, lest I be regarded as uncharitable, Mr. Sugrim, for the very kind words you said about my role in the Economic Recovery Program, because as a matter of fact, I lost many friends when I took on that task, both in the University of the West Indies, for example, and some elsewhere, and domestically, because it was an unpopular move for an academic to take on, and some people didn't believe it was soluble because they didn't like the political context. There was some success in this regard, and I appreciated that you would be prepared to acknowledge that, and I thank you very much. I didn't want to let it pass lest you think that I was being ungracious. Thanks.
Oh, that was good. And we get into other details of your political life later on. Dr. Rose?
Yes, Mr. Greenidge, welcome to the program. It's a pleasure having you here.
Thank you.
Can you tell our listeners what is your present position in the government?
Well, as I explained it, I'm not really part of the government in the sense I'm not a cabinet member. I'm not a minister. I'm advisor. I'm the advisor. But perhaps more importantly, in terms of the activity I'm carrying out now, my work is primarily, not exclusively, but primarily in relation to pursuing the case at the ICJ with the controversy. That is my task. That's the center of my work. And it is for that reason, I see it as actually a non-political undertaking, meaning that it is not something that requires me to intervene in support of the government in circumstances where the opposition is saying, look, we don't agree with that. Because this is meant to be a non-partisan task, and it is very important that it remain that way before the court and before the international community. One of the problems that would bedevil a country that has a border problem as intractable and as outrageous in a way, in its size and its likely impact, is when within the country you cannot find, if you like, common ground between the politicians in dealing with this matter. And I would say we have perhaps led the way in relation to Venezuela, because they recognize the problems of the political parties not being seen to be pursuing the same line, and therefore recently went out of their way to try and suggest that they are agreed on this matter. But as far as Guyana is concerned right now, and since, I would say to you, since around 2016, we have been able to go together, to all intents and purposes, in tackling this matter. We have had on the advisory committee to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, we've had a PPP representative until 2020. And since 2020, we have ensured also, or tried to ensure, that the PPP, for its part, as the government, includes the representative of the opposition party or opposition parties in our deliberations. So the material is shared with the political party, invitations are extended to the representative, and the discussions, both internally and with our lawyers, are intended to include the representative of the opposition party. And if that doesn't always happen, it usually is due to, if you like, circumstances beyond, at least beyond this office's control, and beyond perhaps in the normal circumstances, unusual events. But it is central to this operation that it is recognized as being non-partisan, and that is in the sense in which I'm wanting you to treat it as non-political, meaning that members of the international community, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, members of the international community, the members of the legal fraternity that worked on this matter with Guyana, have emphasized to the government the importance of the case being put to the ICJ as a case that all Guyana embraces. And in that sense, we probably have more problems with our newspapers and some of the representatives outside of the political parties than we do in the political parties, because sometimes people don't stop to look at all the nuances and the subtleties. And I say this because you will be aware that at least one of our papers had been carrying for a long time a long battle, suggesting that, for example, we were pursuing the wrong route because the Secretary General could not and was not empowered to have the matter referred to the ICJ. They were proven wrong. The Secretary General decided that the matter had to be resolved by the ICJ, and the newspaper has quietly dropped that without ever admitting publicly that it was carrying or trying to persuade the public of something that was quite wrong. And I would say that is quite typical of how we behave. And you also had, after the court decision, a very prominent and well-respected Guyana lawyer, I think perhaps not quite realizing all the nuances of the case, criticizing the court for the decision it had taken, which is a decision that we had requested by and large. We had asked the court to acknowledge that it has jurisdiction because Venezuela, as is required by the court's articles, Venezuela had, in the 1966 Geneva Agreement, accepted the jurisdiction of the court. Article 4 referred to the UN Charter, Article 33, and Article 33 of the UN Charter, which is one of the means that the SG can choose, makes specific mention of the court. The highest court in the world, within the UN system then, is the ICJ. And the Venezuelans agreed to that. And yet you can find in the case management meetings and in the statements by President Maduro, the allegation or assertion that they had not agreed to the jurisdiction of the court. Completely untrue. And we find ourselves sometimes some of our public speakers, I don't mean by the government or the opposition, but pronouncements are made that give credence to Venezuela's actions or Venezuela's statements. The court rejected this unambiguously because on a second occasion, the letter signed by the Secretary General in December 2016, the Secretary General offered the countries what he called a last chance or another year of dialogue under the Good Offices Program. I don't have to go through that for you. I'm sure you remember all the major actors there, prominent Caribbean nationals. And then they decided that because Guyana was dissatisfied with what had happened so far under the domain of the Secretary General, that the UN Secretary General was asked to use the court as the last means which had not been tried. Instead of acquiescing with that, the Secretary General decided to have a last try. A year was wasted because Venezuela strung us out, that is the SG and Guyana, and wouldn't agree to his appointment of a personal representative. 6 names were given to him and it was by him, and they were struck down until eventually he chose, and this is done in consultation with the new or the incoming Secretary General, Mr. Gutierrez, Mr. Doug Newlander. And so you arrive at a situation where the SG has chosen a modality called enhanced mediation. So you had an arbitration panel, which the decision of which was accepted. You had a moratorium, 1970 to 1982, and then you had 87 onwards, good offices using a number of prominent Caribbean nationals, and then the SG tried a last year of effort. It didn't work. He then tried another last year of effort under Doug Newlander, and under Doug Newlander, the 2 sides agreed in a letter sent to them by the SG, if this consultation that is called enhanced mediation does not yield a narrowing of the 2 countries' positions, I will refer the matter to the ICJ, and I will refer it unless you, so there's a second condition, unless you 2 countries write me saying, we don't want this matter taken to the ICJ. They never wrote.
Mr. Greenidge, we're going to come back to that. I'll give you some time to explain that, which was very good. But I want to touch back on party politics, which is
okay.
Topic. But I just want to go back there. Your party, the PNC, I think was in 2014, you ran for the leadership and you lost.
2011.
2011. Yeah, that's right. And you lost to Mr. Granger. What advice you can give to the current leaders today, and why you did not seek the leadership?
What advice can I give to the current leaders?
Yes.
Well, as I indicated in a letter last year, not a letter, in response to a journalist who posed me this question, I responded by indicating that this party, the People's National Congress, has rules governing its operations, governing the powers of the leader of the party, the chairman, election procedures, and so forth. And that unless those rules were followed, and at that time they were not being followed, there would be confusion. And that you can see, even if the leader of the party didn't accept my position on that matter last year, which they did not in a very harsh response to my commentary, the world accepts it now. And the party has to implement the arrangements in place to ensure that it is seen to be acting constitutionally. And what I would say to you is that I don't want to say much more on the matter, but what I can say is that the all the former general secretaries, 3 of the former general secretaries of the party, 2 of the leaders of the Young Socialist Movement, the young arm of the party, have met to look at the problems confronting the party now and in the period immediately preceding the 2020 elections, and have written the leader of the party expressing both their concerns and their suggestions for moving forward. Whilst those have not been made public, I agree completely with the concerns they expressed as I understand them. I haven't been given the communication, but I understand the concerns they raised, and the issue they point to seem very similar to the ones that I had raised last year, and I embraced them without question. I believe even the chairman of the party has herself shared her own views and concerns, and has called for the party, its central exec, and those in a position to do so, to respect the rules and to move forward in a manner consistent with the principles on which the party was established. Because that
why you did not seek the leadership now?
Well, let me say to you that the concerns raised by these persons, by the group that I've named, include the mechanism governing the electoral process. And you will have heard a number of concerns raised about the electoral process. The officers and the leader of the party, and the way that that process has unfolded from time to time. And unless that is changed, in my view, and now it's an entirely personal view, not only will you get a repetition of what happened prior to the election in which I participated, and subsequent to the election in which I participated, and in the future. Unless that happens, you are going to get this sort of fallout where participants walk off alleging abuse and corruption and so forth. That mechanism has to be fixed. And in my view, unless it is fixed, the exercise of holding an election as took place in 2011 and afterwards is not going to yield a new result. You will remember that Mr. Norton, for example, walked off after an election in which he participated with Mr. Granger. You will remember prior to that, there were others, Mr. Alexander and others, who walked off. And that reflects a dissatisfaction with the way that the rules were handled, if they were taken into account at all. So in those circumstances, there is a lot of work to be done before the party can put itself in a position in which, as I indicated, and as you will find out, most of its former leaders who are alive and active or near active, or even not active, but alive and alert, will be happy.
Can you run an election and run and lost to President Granger in 2011, but there were a lot of controversies surrounding those election results. Did you think you lost?
Did I think I lost?
Yes.
Well, let me leave it to the observers. I will say one thing to you, that it is unusual. If you recall the process, I don't know whether you paid attention to it. That process was a process in which the persons managing the vote opened the ballots and made public what they opened and laid them down on a desk in piles according to who were the recipients of the vote. And then after a table was covered in these ballots, there was a call for there to be a break so that a raffle could be held, something like that. I don't remember all the details, I prefer not to. And during that period, a number of persons who were not scrutineers appeared at the table. Let me say nothing except that it is unusual for an individual or a couple of individuals to count, let us say, $100 or $110 bills or $1,000 bills and come up with an error or a difference that would run from, let us say, 95 to 107. Normally, if you count 100 and you make a mistake, it's because two bills stick together and you will arrive at a result that is maybe 1% or less than 1% by way of an error. So there were lots of things unusual about that ballot, and I wouldn't want to say anything else about it.
Is those people who were not scrutineers actually caused you to lose the election? And
I'm not saying anything. Anything about that. I'm just
I'm deducing that from your statement. I'm deducing that from your statement.
Probability is the beast here.
I'm deducing that from your statement.
Anyway, okay, I leave that to you.
Anyway, you mentioned Mr. Vincent Alexander when he lost to Corbyn. He actually moved aside from the party and Aubrey Norton and so forth. You lost to Mr. Greenidge in a very, very controversial election, which you know, from what I was told deep down in your heart, that you had won. Why didn't you walk away from the party?
Well, in 2011, I did not walk away. Let us not respond to the background you're putting, because there was a job to be done at the time. And there was perhaps such a concern over the alternative scenario by many of the members of the party that their call was for a movement forward with a promise that that mechanism would be fixed in future.
Charles, over to you.
Mr. Greenidge, just to follow up,
Sure.
is what you just mentioned there, and I'm not disparaging the PNC, but that's the fear that the Guyanese have, that if the internal elections of the PNC is rigged, it seems to me that that pattern, and I know we had Mr. Green and he said the PNC did not rig from 68 to wherever. He used a system. So that's the fear Guyanese have, that within the PNC itself, for the internal election, they seem to have issue there. But that's beside the point. Is that why, Mr. Greenidge, that when the coalition won in 2015, that President Greenidge, instead of pointing you to a position that you mastered in the 80s, he threw you away into foreign ministry, so you're away from Guyana more than you're inside of Guyana?
Mr. Sugrim, there is a concept in Creole of putting somebody's belly on plimpla. You know that one? I hope you're not trying to put my belly on plimpla in this case. Let me say two things to you. First of all, that you ought not to labor under the misapprehension that either formally or informally, the challenges to election results are peculiar to the PNC. There have been court cases against the PPP, which the PPP itself never implemented the decisions that were made, for example, in elections in a previous period. Let me leave it that way. So it is part of the political culture of Guyana for questionable things to be done by the political parties. I want that to be clear. It isn't a phenomenon peculiar to one party or the other. Even in the internal elections, and I will point you to difficulties that and disenchantment that some members of the PPP expressed after their own elections. But it's not my task here to be addressing that issue. And I think any pronouncement in relation to to that matter perhaps would be better made at a different place and on the basis of a more careful analysis of that issue. So that is really all I want to say on that matter, that it is the responsibility of the public, and I say this and people seem to misinterpret it. If you have a leadership, whether you're in the PNC, PPP, AFC, it's the responsibility of the membership to hold the feet of their leadership to the fire, whether they're operating internally in terms of election processes, listening to what people have to say, paying attention to their supporters, or whether it is in terms of the national interest as a whole. That has been my view. That's been my position all the time. And I would say that now that I'm not in the political arena, seeking to defend the position of one party or the other. It is important, because if you don't do that, you'll be derailed. And that is really what I want to say in that regard. And it is, Guyanese must remember that, otherwise we will have difficulty.
And you're correct, Mr. Greenidge. It's not exclusive to the PNC, because in fairness to the PNC, I think they had a broader base electing the leader, whereas in the PPP, it was the central executive of the party that elected the leader and not their broad base. So yeah, they're both sides. But Mr. Greenidge, I know after the Charandas issue and the issue of citizenship came up, and I believe from all report that you're still a British citizen. Is that correct? If you are, then you cannot run for the elected office. Is that so?
Well, Mr. Sugrim, it may be that some members of the coalition still hold dual citizenship. But as far as the public should be aware, I did not only relinquish the citizenship, but I indicated publicly that that had occurred, and I wrote a letter both to the leader and to the press confirming that. So if there is any doubt that somebody didn't relinquish their citizenship, that doubt doesn't apply to me.
Thank you, sir. So, in relation to Dr. Rose and I, we are dual citizenship. So you're now full Guyanese and not dual.
Speak for yourself. Speak for yourself.
Let me make one point very clear. The question of me being full Guyanese needs to be seen in this light. Before the legislation was changed requiring members of parliament not to have an allegiance to another country. It is not about citizenship, it's about allegiance. Let's make that clear. I didn't want to tie up the system by trying to recruit a lawyer to fight that problem, but the passport and allegiance are not exactly the same thing. When I was employed by CARICOM at the CRNM, which is the regional negotiating machinery, almost invariably when the team sat down at a discussion and that negotiation was finished, they would turn to teasing me about my fierce defense of things Guyanese, not only of things Caribbean, but also of things Guyanese. And prior to my appointment in the Granger cabinet, nobody ever found that I had undertaken any action that was not in the public interest. So changing the national legislation will be, isn't it very strange that one should think that a man who has operated for 30 years looking after your political interests, looking after your international interests, could suddenly be looked at suspiciously because national legislation is changed. Do you know that in the negotiations in 87 and 89 of the Paris Club, the entire gathering of donors in the Paris Club, I think, became very, very, how would Caribbean people put it? I think in the street, well, let me say, they were very unhappy with the fact that I had held out until about 4 o'clock in the morning. I was to hear this from what was to be a future employee, holding out for better terms for Guyana in those negotiations. In other words, they thought that in my fight for the national interest in Guyana, I was a nuisance. And here it is that Guyanese, who have not done a tenth of the things that I have tried to do or achieved, can feel, and I'm not speaking of you here, I'm speaking of those who were around the debate, arguing that, well, one has to be suspicious about the behavior and activities of that person. It is very ironic, I would say. The test of whether somebody's looking after the national interest doesn't turn on the passport they have or the number of passports that they have, but on the work that they do for you and the amount of pain and, if you like, resistance they're prepared to confront in the national interest. And I'm very proud of what I've done in that.
And I agree with you, Mr. Greenidge. We have to go to a short break, but except to say that it is in the Constitution that we cannot be dual citizen and still be...
No, the Constitution doesn't say that.
It was the People's Representative People's Act?
It doesn't say that.
Well, I think
allegiance. It speaks of allegiance, swearing allegiance to states.
So someone born in the UK, for instance, like you, if you were born in the UK.
No, I wasn't born in the UK.
Okay.
Everybody knows that I was born in New Amsterdam, and I'm always embroiled in some argument over Berbetians versus the rest of the country, because the rest of the country is not fully appreciative of how heavily dependent they are on Berbice.
I think the president's son-in-law was born in the UK, so he had a legitimate right for an allegiance because he was born there. So you automatically get a UK passport. But that's a different arrangement. We'll take a short commercial break.
No, before we break, I want all the listeners to know, and Mr. Greenidge, you to know that, and my colleague as well, that I'm a citizen of the world.
Okay. Yeah, because Dr. Rose has a different passport around the world. That's so right. Anyway, gentlemen, we'll be back shortly. We take a short commercial break, and audience, don't go nowhere. We'll be right back.
Are you missing homemade food, snacks, drinks, roti and curries, or have a busy schedule? Then get your favorite curries and roti delivered directly to your home with all from one supplier. Come order your duck, goat, or chicken, fully cooked and ready to eat with dal puri or bus up shut. We also now have chicken tikka masala or lamb vindaloo available with regular naan or garlic naan. Don't forget to add your solo, icy, coconut water, or Nestle drinks to these delicious meals. Select your choice, and load your box and let allfromonesupplier.com deliver directly to your home. All from One Supplier has you covered for all your food. Plus, if you need pepper sauce, curry powders, fish, meat, ghee, and so much more. We also have tasty pastries like pine tarts, cheese rolls, currants rolls, coconut rolls and so much more. Sales are ongoing every week, and your first order is 10% off once you apply the coupon code, Globespan24x7. Log on to allfromonesupplier.com today and purchase. Allfromonesupplier.com is your one-stop shop for all West Indian items, and remember, it's free shipping to all U.S. states.
Globespan Alaska Cruise is available from May 29th to June 5th, 2022. Enjoy an unbelievable experience with a 7-night multi-glacier cruise. Travel through a beautiful land on a world-class ship and visit the famous Alaskan glaciers up close. This cruise departs from Vancouver and enjoy a tour to several different ports. At the end, you will also have an opportunity for a city tour. Call Globespan today to book your trip, with affordable payment plans available. In New York, call 212-243-0865. Georgetown, call 227-1701. Berbice, call 337 4287. Trinidad, call 645-1604. Travel plans? Call Travelspan, serving you for 27 plus years.
Folks, the Nest Restaurant is the place to dine for Guyanese and Caribbean dishes. It is the best restaurant in Queens, the staff is courteous, and Dave the owner is always there to welcome you. So for a memorable dining experience, visit the Nest Restaurant located at 12717 101 Avenue, South Richmond Hill. Go and make a reservation today, or takeout, call 718-847-4035.
To our viewers, as we continue discussion on Guyana's foreign policy and the border dispute with our honorable guest, former Minister of Finance, former Minister of Foreign Affairs, and now advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Guyana, Mr. Carl Greenidge. Mr. Greenidge, before we go to break, I got a question from one of a gentleman who supported the coalition in 2015, Gobin Harbajan. And he said he had a lengthy discussion with you in Berbice before the election of 2020. And he told you that Mr. Ramjatan, being the prime minister candidate, was not selling with the Indians in Berbice. And that is why he believed that the coalition lost the election, because Mr. Ramjatan was the prime minister candidate. Do you want to clear any views on that? He said he discussed it thoroughly with you.
Well, most certainly this was a question that would have been raised by a number of persons. People have views on anything you can think of in politics. Now, Gobin is an ally with whom I work extensively, and he was a very good ally working on the election campaign. On that particular matter, I have to admit I do not agree with him, okay, for two reasons. One, we may disagree on. He may have a view as to how the constituency in Berbice and elsewhere, the Indian element of that constituency might have reacted, which is different from mine. I do not think that he lost us votes in that regard. But I also want to say that Mr. Ramjatan, in his work with the coalition before the 2015 elections, was a hardworking, reliable, and perceptive ally. He did what was necessary. And I will point you to some of the legislation that we passed in opposition when we had a majority, which legislation dealt with issues ranging from financial management to the constitutional issues. I see people taking credit, for example, to in relation to the matter of the constitutional offices. But I can say to you that Mr. Ramjatan worked more closely than any of the other AFC members on many of these things, with me in particular. He may have worked closely with others to get those things through and to draw to the attention of the public the concerns that we had and our attempts to improve the well-being of the constituency, Indian and non-Indian. And the failure of the APNU in the 2020 elections has several causes. Fortunately or unfortunately in politics, there is actually rarely a silver bullet. It's very rare for you to be able to find one answer as to why you lost an election, why you lost a particular constituency, and you have to do the hard work. That is to discover that there are many reasons. You have to fix all of them. If we could just win an election by changing the name of one person, it would be a very, very easy operation.
All right, thank you. Let's get back to the border dispute. And we want to also, for you to tell our viewers, what do you think? Of course, Guyana want to win the case and to settle that border dispute once and for all. But you know, Mr. Greenidge, a lot of Venezuelans are coming to Guyana in droves. I know they're going to Brazil, they're going to Colombia and so on, but a lot coming to Guyana. do you think that in the set of coming to Guyana, there are spies that Maduro would have planted and they would have given him information, sensitive information? And you know how spies work. They get very close to the politicians, you know, they send the pretty ladies and they, you know, and all these things. You know, that's a strategy, I mean, that happened here in the United States. Is it possible that there are spies planted in the Maduro regime to send Venezuelans to get more information in Guyana, what's going on within Guyana?
Well, I'm sure that it is possible. Whether this takes place to any significant extent would depend on what you think the end game of Mr. Maduro and his cabinet are. I will come back to that. For the moment, let me say this, that the case before the ICJ is a case that Guyana can win and is likely to win, because the government of Venezuela does not have, if you like, good ground in this case. They do not have, and they are not arguing for example, historical occupation of the entire Essequibo. They're talking about 1492 and what the Pope did, the Pope who was a Portuguese national born in Spain, giving half the world or nearly half the world to Spain and Portugal, as though in the 21st century one is expected to embrace that. If you look at even something like the Creole of the Essequibo, you will find the Creole of the Essequibo is a rather interesting Creole worked on by Guyanese, and now you see increasingly by Dutch linguists, showing the special features of this Creole, which identify it not only to peculiarities in Guyana, but especially peculiarities in the Netherlands and parts of the Netherlands, those parts of the Netherlands that played a primary role in the investment in the Dutch West India Company. And so the reality is that in 1648, the Spanish government, which has never publicly supported Venezuela's case, gave the independence to the United Provinces, that is the Netherlands and Belgium. They got their independence, and along with their independence, they got the colonies in the East Indies, and these three, Demerara, Essequibo, and Berbice, which have never been separated after 1648. And so the case that Venezuela has, so far, the case has turned on all sorts of misrepresentations. I made mention just now over the fact that Venezuela signed a treaty in 1966 and then denied that it had, by signing that treaty, given its concurrence to the court having jurisdiction. It agreed to a process in 2016 and then denied that it had agreed to that process. It has signed with Brazil and Guyana and the United Kingdom treaties which, if you like, define our borders in one way or the other. And yet you will find documentation denying that this has happened. So they have no case, and that is why the Mallet Prevost's letter of 1944 has never surfaced in any discussion that was meant to resolve this problem. When Sir Donald Jackson and Mohammed Shahabuddin and Shirley Field Ridley and others worked on this case in 1966 in the Mixed Commission, the Venezuelan contention about the validity or invalidity of the 1899 award never arose. The so-called letter of 1944, which they were required to hold until all the participants had died, it never arose. They have No case. And that is why Venezuela does not appear before the court except by other than explicit means. So now they're attempting to bring in friends of the court, although they say it's not them, it's the friends of Venezuela, looking after the interests of supposedly indigenous people and Venezuelans who are properly the citizens of Essequibo, and yet they're locking up people from the Essequibo who have been fishing in the territory of the Essequibo coast. So they have a lot of problems to deal with, and having spies in Guyana is not going to solve that problem, because the spies cannot undo the history. What they're trying to do is to have the court and the world forget that between 1648 and 1962, many treaties, many activities, many things have happened, and you now suddenly go back to 1494 to say, well, we have been, or we were given this, and therefore this is ours. They cannot make a case within that period. So it doesn't matter if indeed Venezuela has a military objective in mind. Whether or not there are spies here would make no difference, because Venezuela has the military capacity to be disruptive or worse. It doesn't require 2 or 3 spies. In terms of the maritime vessels they have, the naval vessels, the aircraft, and all of these things, it is not the absence of spies that are protecting us. It is our work on the diplomatic front, our work with bilaterals. It is success in keeping our people together. It is also the work of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and our missions abroad. This is how we're going to be protected. This is the front line of defense. I'm not saying nothing else matters, but these are the first lines of defense. And while spies can come in order to make way for the military intervention by Venezuela in Guyana can have a cost. And it is up to us, in our work with our diplomats, in our work on the bilateral and international arena, working with the African, Caribbean, and Pacific group of states, working with the Commonwealth, working with the OS, working with our Latin American allies, to ensure that people understand and remember what this dispute is about. You know, like Guatemala, the case seemed to have lost momentum when Guyana was a colony, and Venezuela was arguing that its stand is an anti-colonial one. But you know, when the time came for Guyana to get its independence, it suddenly took on a different hue. They were fighting to deny us independence unless they got 3/4 of Guyana. So that is one of the contradictions that the Chavista government today has to face, that there is a contradiction in the radical position they're trying to take internationally and what seems to be a post-colonial grab, an attempt to make themselves a sub-imperial power in the region. Venezuela already has the largest Caribbean coast of any country in the Americas, and yet it is seeking to annex the Caribbean coast, the Atlantic coast, so that they can become now an Atlantic power. We don't have any ambition of being an Arctic power or a Pacific power. We can't argue that it's unfair that we are at Guyanese, or we as Barbadians have generated such brilliant people over the years, and we are not in a position to influence what happens in the Sahara or on the Pacific. This is how we have inherited. This is our heritage. We can't attempt to change the world by military and other means so that can be corrected. And the same applies to Venezuela. They don't have an Atlantic coast, and they're not going to get an Atlantic coast by seizing the territories of Guyana and 9 other Caribbean territories, because it is not only Guyana that this problem, that confronts this problem. Okay, when they finished sending the spies and seizing the Essequibo and the Demerara and Berbice, because the claim on the maritime space extends beyond Essequibo. They're going to go and do the same in St. Vincent. They're going to do the same in Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados and claim all the maritime space of those countries. Are those countries going to sit and allow Venezuela to do this because it has promised them, or it has given them petrol in the past at an interest discount because it wasn't free? No. And that is why I say, and I say it to the government all the time, this problem is not only about the court. The problem you are raising about our defense from military intervention is similar to what the Germans did by making reference to German migrants in the countries around Germany, talking about the Sudetenland, and therefore they're coming to rescue these people. I don't know what the end game is. I asked you whether you knew, but all I'm saying is that your protection against that is in the realm of diplomacy and politics. You have to work with your neighbors and work with your friends. Work with international institutions, work on your own institutions to build their capacity and ensure that the political divisions of Guyana don't get in the way. I mean, if I sound as though I'm belaboring this, it is for a reason. Because Guyanese believe that somebody outside of these borders is going to save them. You will not be saved unless you save yourself. You look after your business, you deal with bilaterals, you work on the multilaterals. You don't sit and wait until you're in trouble to go and talk to a neighbor. You don't attend meetings and say nothing whilst the other countries have problems that you can help in. In other words, you have to embrace international norms, whether they be in the energy realm or any other realm, so that when you are confronted by a bully across the borders, the rest of the world pays attention. This is the secret. There's no silver bullet here. Legwork has to be done. Your institutions have to be built up and strengthened.
Thank you, Mr. Greenidge. I see the wisdom in President Ali keeping you to help them along this path. Dr. Rose?
Mr. Greenidge, as you said, Guyana has a very good chance of winning the case at the ICJ. And I strongly believe that as someone who studies international law. But as you know, the ICJ is at times a tiger without a teeth. It has made a lot of pronouncements without any enforcement. Now, Mr. Maduro, he said he will not respect or accept any decision made by the ICJ. And as you know, a country or a government can put myself and you in prison, but you can't put a country in prison. So if Maduro don't accept that decision made by the ICJ against Venezuela, where do we stand?
Can I put that question to you, comrade, if you don't mind me calling you by that title, just to take us back a few decades, since it isn't a new problem. Does Venezuela have difficulties at this point in time?
They do, yes.
It has difficulties, okay. Were those difficulties caused by the ICJ?
No. Were
they caused by Guyana?
No.
Okay, that means that you don't need the ICJ if the world is to put pressure on Venezuela. You don't need the ICJ. Do you understand what I'm saying? In other words, the country that defies the world will find that it pays a price. And whilst it is true that as a result of both the US and other countries, including China, defying the ICJ, there is, as a consequence, what they might call implementation pessimism. Can I use that term? To say that, yes, the ICJ will make a decision, but it can't enforce it because it doesn't have an army. So people are pessimistic. I'm saying to you that the pressure that a country can feel, whether it is Venezuela or whether it is Iraq, can originate from sources other than the court. And it is our job to make sure that we are in tune with those other arenas. And I don't mean the military. I'm not speaking about the military, but that is part of it. This is what I mean by the diplomatic and the political work. So if a country can be brought almost to its knees by the international community, some people say without good reason, you make sure that there's good reason to defend your case. And when the time arises, the country will weigh the options before it and say, you know, in the light of the fact that the world believes that Guyana stands in the right, that Guyana has been with us when we have been working to enforce the rule of law internationally, that Guyana has intervened on behalf of SIDS, that Guyana has worked to look after the interests of non-aligned or other countries. In the light of that, we had better not try to do damage to Guyana, either by marching troops in or by trying to seize their assets and resources. That is the only protection a small country has. You don't have, and you can't depend on the automatic intervention of any military ally. You have to depend on the support of everyone, all of the international community, except those who, or that one which wishes you harm. You have to constantly work on the others. Make sure you don't make any unnecessary enemies. Make sure that people regard you as a trustworthy partner. That is the secret. There's no other secret. And if you look at the countries that have managed to avoid the boots, the big boots, the army boots of their neighbors, you will see that that is how a lot of them work. We have to pay attention to that. And that's all I say. I'm not saying the other things don't matter. I'm saying that the court is a court made up of human beings. It may, from time to time, do things that you might not anticipate or you may not like. But your protection from that, just as your protection from Venezuela, is to do the right things for as long and as often as possible and make sure that your case is understood in all quarters. And you can't do this by seeing that as the job of Greenidge alone. You can't see that as being the job of the Minister of Industry. It's the job of all Guyanese, including Guyanese with passports other than that of Guyana. Those members of the diaspora who like to see their salvation in whatever country they live, United States or in the United Kingdom. You have a lot in the Netherlands too. You have sympathizers even in Switzerland. It is your job to make sure that they are part and parcel of that story that you tell, of the pressure that you bring to bear on bilaterals and the international community. You have to use all the weapons at your disposal in that regard. And I'm saying this because I don't believe that the average Guyanese in the street understands that. I don't believe that all our Guyanese politicians understand that. And I believe that as regards the latter, some of them are tired of me saying that every 2 minutes, as you probably are now. But it needs to be said because I think sometimes we, as people who are well educated and believers in science, seem to depend upon black magic and Obia to do things that we don't have to depend on black magic and Obia to do. There are clear paths to defend your borders. Yeah, but
Mr. Greenidge, before Dr. Rose come on, if you don't mind, when Venezuela had redrawn their map and they had the entire Essequibo part of their territory, Then opposition leader Barajak, they strongly support the government to condemn that act. Recently, the President Maduro and the opposition, they made a statement, but the opposition, current opposition, I can't recall they support the government in condemning Venezuela. So if you're asking for us to support from the diaspora, within Guyana itself, it seems that the opposition, as it currently, do not want to support the government in that stand. What is your view?
Well, my view is, first of all, that you are not right. First of all, the government and the opposition had some exchanges. As a matter of fact, I even complained without consulting me, and they agreed that they were opposed to the ruse of Venezuela, which was intended, and the Venezuelan opposition will discover this, to get the Venezuelan opposition by almost bribing it, the promise of something, when in fact they will continue to behave in the way that they've always behaved. But that's not our business. Our business is to ensure that our diaspora uses their voice and recognizes that they have to do their work. And as you know, that diaspora has been pretty powerful. You ask about the APNU, maybe the strongest voices as regards the APNU in the political arena, certainly before and since 2000, has been on the international front, that diaspora abroad.
Mr. Greenidge, sorry to cut you. I thought recently with this opposition and government meeting in Venezuela, did the opposition support the government?
The opposition,
I didn't see that. So my apologies.
I am sure that they will not. You see, the opposition has invested a lot of time when they were in office in arriving at this current position. They would be foolhardy now to turn their back on it and say, we don't support it because it's a different government in office and we agree with Venezuela. If Venezuela were able to be successful in seizing 3/4 of Guyana, the opposition and the government will have much less resources and people to manage. They'll have a far more unstable country to manage. So it's in none of their interests to see this initiative by Venezuela, not in terms of getting opposition and government unity, but an attempt to seize Guyana's territory by backdoor means. That is really what they have recognized, and I'm quite sure that I might be bold enough to say to you that they're not likely to see or allow a space between themselves and the government in relation to that particular matter and any similar action by the Venezuelan government.
As you know, Mr. Greenidge, President Maduro has absolute power. And if we can recall what the late Lord Acton said, absolute power corrupts absolutely, meaning that no government will want to give up power without a fight. Now, having said that, I want you to tell me why, in Maduro's interest, all the pressures applied on him by sanctions from the United States and all these countries. You know very well, sanctions only affect the poor people of a country. The elites escape all sanctions. So apparently, the sanctions are not working against Venezuela because Maduro, he preferred to see Venezuela collapse totally before he gives in. So where do you stand with a guy like this, which some call an egomaniac or whatever adjective you want to use, but he will not give in to no sanctions?
Okay, I am not in the business, and I'm not in a position to psychoanalyze President Maduro or his cabal, because it's not what the Venezuelan government is doing is not a product only of the Venezuelan government. I just remind you that Mr. Guaido has been coming to Ankoko each year to call upon the Venezuelan military to restore or reassert Venezuelan sovereignty over the Essequibo. So don't see it as a Maduro problem alone. It is Mr. Maduro, a lot of members of the legislative of Venezuela, as well as the military. We like to think, well, it's only the Venezuelan Navy. That is not the case. It is Mr. Maduro and his cabinet and a whole set of others around him. And the point is this: it is not that the sanctions against Mr. Maduro have not damaged the leadership of Venezuela. It has damaged the leadership. The question you have to ask yourself, and they will ask themselves, do we want to invite additional sanctions wherever they may stand now? And those actions haven't brought them down. Do they want more? Okay, but our business, as I keep saying, is not to really second guess the world and the impact of the world's actions. Our business is to use the weapons at our disposal. And those weapons, I don't want to repeat what they are. It is our job to do that and to worry afterwards about how effective they are and whether we ought to do other things. Because remember, what I'm saying to you, we are, the tools at our disposal are the ones I mentioned. But the court makes a decision, and if that decision is defied, we don't only have to work at the bilateral level. We can then turn to the Security Council and to the General Assembly of the United Nations. The rules are that it is the function of those agencies to enforce the decisions of the court. No country has the right to defy the court. And it is in that context I'm saying to you, let us not be pessimistic. What we have seen, and you know that we have as what is called an ad hoc judge. The court has 15 members who are independent of their countries. Our decision on jurisdiction is one of the largest majorities that the court has had, and included in the court's judges is a judge which is our ad hoc judge. We name a judge to the court because we don't have a member of the court who is from Guyana. And that judge, prior to her membership of the court, has been an academic and been writing on the effectiveness of the court and the implementation of the court's decision. And I invite you to have a look at or to have our listeners look at the conclusion of Dr. O'Donoghue to the efficacy of the court's decisions. And what she's arguing effectively says, look, don't despair over the fact that the court has no army to enforce its rules. There are other mechanisms for effecting the decisions of the court. And what we have seen within the last 10 to 15 years is an increasing number of the court's decisions going through without being bucked, or where the decisions are bucked, they're eventually implemented, notwithstanding the initial attacks and attempt to undermine the court. And this is what I'm drawing your attention to. Yes, at the beginning of the 2000s, you had a lot of countries saying, no, we're not going to take any notice of the court's decision. And only the other week, you had an ally of Guyana, Kenya, reacting to a decision taken by the court in favor of Somalia, of all countries, saying it wouldn't accept the decision of the court, having started by participating in the court's decision. But I'm not wanting to give away my secret, but I have written a note to one of our editors. Starbuck News had on the 20th of October a piece comparing or drawing attention to that decision by the court. And what I'm saying is that you should not despair over the fact that much of the rules at this international level require, if you like, voluntary compliance, because there are ways that the international community has been able to bring to bear on these actors internationally. It's true that they haven't been able to do it with respect to everyone, but even in the case of Nigeria and Cameroon, do you remember that case? Nigeria was saying no, under no circumstances. And Nigeria is more militarily more powerful. It's a far bigger country than Cameroon. They are immediate neighbors. They are, they are siblings to all intents and purposes. Eventually, that language by Nigeria has abated. And as far as I can see, to all intents and purposes, Nigeria has come from being one of the most implacably opposed critics of the court in relation to its rulings on the common problem to implementing it. If they can be persuaded, others can be.
I have read some of Dr. Aknoub articles, and she herself said that the only time the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, will be fully respected is that it should establish an army. The United Nations should have an army to back its decision and its pronouncement so that all will have to respect its decision. And she also made mention that only a few border disputes have been settled without a war. So she's saying that the ICJ needs an army to make sure that its decisions are being respected by all bodies.
I am afraid that I must take issue with you here. As I was saying to you, I've just written a piece on this one, and I don't know whether you want me to quote her, because I have here a passage from both her analysis and a fellow who has a name of some Berbicians, Lamazon. You know that name? Anyway, there is a writer by the name of Lamazon who wrote something on the effectiveness or the matter of non-compliance with ICJ decisions, and also she did. She said that one should not give up on the ICJ simply because of its lack of formal enforcement mechanisms. This is what she calls, and I use pessimism just now, but her language was enforcement obsession. She is decrying enforcement obsession. She's saying it is a mistake because enforcement needs to be read in the light of the collective security system. Careful analysis of the court's history subsequent to the Nicaragua USA landmark case suggests, and I quote, that through complex mechanisms of authority, an authority signal, and the political inertia induced by those decisions, almost all of the court's decisions have achieved substantial, albeit imperfect, compliance. So you see, it's not quite as extreme as saying you must have an army before the court can have its decisions implemented.
But it's the same thing she's saying. Her article, I think, is by way of justice. The ICJ be enforced. That's one of her articles, which she argued for collective security, yes, but a United Nations army to enforce the ICJ rules.
But I have no I have no quarrel with that, All I'm saying to you is that is an extreme. Until you have the army, you can still do other things. This is the work of diplomacy, Diplomacy is the front line, the first line of defense. You can't have first resort to an army. You have first resort to diplomacy. This has been almost as old a discipline as that other area that men are fond of making jokes about as the first profession. If that profession is the first profession, I don't want to mention the name now, then diplomacy is the second one.
But how many border disputes are settled by diplomacy, though?
Many of the border disputes are settled by a combination of people standing on their rights, going to the court, and going to regional bodies. If you look, I have also been looking at the disputes in Latin America, which I've seen for the first time. And I don't want to delay you, but I could read you a passage which is very interesting, in which the Latin author is saying, you know something, before Guyana's independence, Venezuela was able, as I was mentioning to you just now, to stand on a principle that says, look, it is fighting imperialism. But when the die was cast, it was 1966, Venezuela lost so much support. And that is why they were willing to accept a moratorium. That's why they were able, the Protocol of Port of Spain, spawned by Dr. Eric Williams. This is part of the work of diplomacy. In 1970, Trinidad and Tobago helped this process where Venezuela was bringing pressure to bear on Guyana by organizing and getting support for a moratorium. It lasted 12 years. Of course, one may argue, like any mechanism, a moratorium has disadvantages. So what happened? At the end of 12 years, people had forgotten what the problem was and saying, oh, haven't you solved that problem yet? You have to start again. And that is why Guyana does not want to go back to the tried and failed tools which Venezuela is trying to persuade the international community. Listen, we don't want to take Guyana by force. That's what the 1966 agreement is about, the peaceful settlement. Okay, so that is why you have to remember the role of the court and the role of the Security Council. The Geneva Agreement is about the peaceful settlement. And what Venezuela is arguing as to the peaceful settlement is saying, look, let's go back and redo those things we did before. Arbitration, you had arbitration, and they then overturned the arbitration decision after 63 years. You had a number of processes, including moratorium, which at the end they overturned. So we have to recognize that this is not going to be easy. We've already spent longer than Somalia and Kenya did. It is 5 years that they were arguing, and they have gone to the court, and the court has made a decision. We have been arguing about it for 50-something years, and our agreement didn't allow us to go to the court before without Venezuela's agreement. So now we are there.
There's a book written by Gashemaya, Wars and Diplomacy: The Settling of Border Disputes. And in that book, he makes the case that most border disputes are settled after wars have been fought. Then after that, they turn to diplomacy to settle it.
All right, gentlemen, I know we have to.
No, I'm not recommending that, but I'm just showing you a practical point of view of what has been taking place in the world from a practical point of view.
All right,
Mr. Greenidge, there are many analyses. I'm sorry, Mr. Sugrim, just to say to you that all of these are analysis as an academic yourself, and perhaps as a former academic myself, we recognize that there are differences of views, even when the same information is available to us. So don't hang your hat on one analysis. It is one.
I don't.
Okay, I think we
don't have to look forward to a war.
I'm not advocating that. I'm not advocating that. No,
I'm so sorry. We have to wrap up now because our time is running out. But in closing, Mr. Greenidge, we didn't talk about foreign policy as much as border dispute.
You see the problem?
I know.
Although I came in the foreign policy.
Is the PPP following the foreign policy that you left, or President Ali is charting a new course? In closing, or they're strengthening what you build on? And as you close, just give us a recap of what you think of what President Ali is heading in the foreign policy department and what you left off as the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Well, President Ali will tell you himself that he is pursuing his own path as regards foreign policy in general. I would say to you that as regards the ICJ case and the border issues, I have been urging that we stick to the path that we've been pursuing in relation to that problem. But on the wider part, let me say the circumstances are different in the sense that the resources available to the government in 2015, resources available to the government in 2021 are vastly different. And whilst in 2020, it's not vastly different from what it is in 2021, it is different enough in terms of what is actually available to provide the government with its own space. In 2018, I think my presentation to the House elaborated some of the focuses of foreign policy. I want to say to you that some of those, including the collaboration with the countries of the Middle East, the Gulf states, is mentioned in there as being an important part. Although some people see it as a radical new movement, I do not see it that way. And there are other dimensions of what is being pursued that are similar. I just like to emphasize that my task here, and although you've left me saying things that I'm sure the political parties on both sides of the divide are not going to be happy with, I want to say to you that the political and the foreign policy we're pursuing has to evolve. Some things we're learning as we go along, some needs are arising as we go along, and so inevitably, if you have a path that the two governments might have decided to pursue, there are going to be points at which they will have to deviate because circumstances are different. Even some of our bilateral partners will have different attitudes to the current government than they had to the predecessor. And that is acceptable because that is how things go. So I've looked at it, but I don't advise the government on general foreign policy. It's more narrow.
Thank you, Mr. Greenidge. I hope that President Ali and Vice President Jagdeo can convince you to join the PPP and they can strengthen the government.
Wow.
Have a much better administration in terms of all these foreign policy issues and so on.
I thought I was invited by friends, not by grave diggers.
No. You're an important resource for Guyana, and any government you will be a benefit to any government. So I hope that President Ali and Vice President Jagdeo will see the wisdom in inviting you to be a part of them and to strengthen their administration. So, Mr. Greenidge, I want to thank you so much for being with us tonight. Anything in closing as we close up tonight? Any final comment?
No, I would say to you, well, thank you very much for the kind sentiments you have expressed at the end. And I would urge that you lend your forum as often as possible to trying to raise the awareness for public. I mean, Guyanese in some ways are not a very nationalistic people, and I feel that strongly. But on the border issue, they are, in my view, very much on the right path. But I don't think enough attention is paid to some of the details so they can understand what is before us. And I would like to urge that you lend your resources as far as possible to ensuring that we keep them up to date and educated on this. I appreciate this exposure that you've given me.
Thank you very much. Dr. Rose, anything in closing?
Yes, I want to say that President Ali is pursuing a very progressive foreign policy based on equity and fairness in the international arena, which is good. Before, I also want to advocate that all government offices must remain open during lunch hours. The government must make sure that seek improvement in the Wi-Fi. It's always breaking down. And it's time to put an end to maternal death as an hospital. We have about 3 or 4 injuries in the past 2 or 3 or 4 months. That should end. And it's also time for banks to release or relax some of those what they contribute to produce. They want everything, IDs and all. The bank should be simple. You go there, make an application, and you get a bank book or a bank account. So those are things I'm advocating for. And I also asking the government to make sure that all civil servants and public servants answer their phones. Public servants do not answer their phones. I want all listeners to know, whenever public servant or civil servant tells you that they will call you back, That's a blatant lie. They never do. They don't call back anybody. So it's about time the government issue edict to tell all public services they must answer the phone. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Dr. Rose said, I'm sorry, Mr. Greenidge, that you have to listen to that for Dr. Rose, but that's his mantra. And he's hoping, I think behind that is that he really wants the Guyanese society to rise to the challenge and to ensure that everything is working well. To our viewers out there, we want to thank you for being with us, to Noir Singh and to Devin, to all our people, good night, stay safe, and we'll see you next week again, God's willing.
Thank you very much.
Take care.